Long ago, before the Ministry of Magic had any clearly defined policy toward magical creatures, and while the wizarding world was still discovering the limits of dark magic, an island appeared on the map, though very few knew it existed. It lay somewhere in the cold, hostile waters of the North Sea. Legend says that when Muggle ships sailed too close to its shores, sinister shadows would rise from the black rocks. The waves, stirred by an endless storm, would smash those vessels against the island's cliffs, condemning their crews to certain death. But supposedly, not everyone died immediately. Many were brought before the dark master of that grim fortress. That dark wizard was said to be Ekrizdis, the man who, according to every indication, began the existence of the Dementors. In the official Harry Potter novels written by J.K. Rowling, meaning the main, widely known canon, we never find his name, nor do we receive a detailed history explaining where Dementors truly came from. Rowling introduces these terrifying guards of Azkaban in the third book, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. But what we know about the island's former owner and about the evil that led to the birth of these creatures comes from extended material published by the author herself on Pottermore, now Wizarding World. And although this story is less known than the main threads of the saga, it offers some deeply disturbing answers. Who was Ekrizdis? Here, we enter the realm of legend, rumor, and scarce mentions in old manuscripts from the Department of Mysteries. Most researchers believe he lived in the 16th or 17th century. He was a dark wizard, and one so powerful that even in those times, when knowledge of dark rituals often exceeded anything imagined today, his name inspired fear. It was said that Ekrizdis was insatiable in his experiments with the deepest forms of dark magic, especially the unforgivable curses and rituals designed to enslave souls. The surviving accounts suggest that this dark wizard wanted to separate himself from the world. That was why he chose a small, bleak island in the North Sea, where no ship ever willingly came ashore. The island was difficult to detect even for wizards. Even if some daring soul tried to find it, they would usually become lost in the fog and perish at sea. All because of the powerful protective enchantments Ekrizdis had woven into something like a magical spider's web spread around the entire island. Ekrizdis loved inflicting pain. For this purpose, he used Muggles, whose ships he lured with his spells and the storms he summoned. When they crashed against the rocks, the dark wizard, driven by perverse delight, supposedly descended into the wreckage and dragged the surviving victims into the depths of his fortress. There, he subjected them to experiments and tortures so cruel that the memory of those acts survived for centuries as a warning even to the darkest students of black magic. But how could he have gained such a terrible reputation if, at least according to legend, he was so secretive and allowed no one to escape the island? Some victims, somehow, did eventually escape death. Perhaps they fled, perhaps they were saved by magic. We do not know. What matters is that, from time to time, stories spread through the wizarding world about a wizard monster who collected souls and savored suffering. And in that way, Ekrizdis became something more than a criminal. He became a horror, a cursed name whispered in magical circles, the fortress from which there was no return. Over time, Ekrizdis expanded his stronghold so that it could serve as a true laboratory for dark magical rituals. He raised high walls, built vast underground chambers, and constructed great towers. Modern records from the Ministry of Magic state that after Ekrizdis' death, when the island was finally discovered, the inside of the fortress terrified even the bravest aurors. The ruins of torture chambers, walls marked by spells, runes carved into stone, all of it remained untouched, as if petrified by evil energy. But the most important discovery inside those walls was the Dementors. They became the greatest problem for the wizards who dared to investigate the abandoned complex. Dementors were not creatures that could simply be driven away. They were certainly not beings that occurred naturally in the wild. They did not resemble animals. They did not possess intelligence in the human sense, and yet they acted with terrifying efficiency. Their only purpose became hunting the emotions and happiness of anyone who came within their reach. So how did they come into existence? According to the most widespread theory, Ekrizdis did not mold the Dementors like a sculptor shaping a statue. Rather, he produced them, or perhaps summoned them, through his dark magic and immeasurable cruelty. The pain, despair, and suffering accumulated over years became, according to many researchers, the natural fuel for the birth of these dark entities. And if we add to that the island's saturation with curses and negative energy, we can assume that the Dementors, in a sense, hatched in the darkness of Ekrizdis's fortress. What the sources and confirmed facts tell us, it must be emphasized, however, that J.K. Rowling never directly gives Ekrizdis's name in the main Harry Potter novels. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban focuses primarily on the fact that Azkaban is a prison guarded by Dementors, cruel wardens, blind and shrouded in black, mist-like robes. Harry's first encounter with a Dementor on the train to Hogwarts remains one of the most memorable scenes in the entire series. That is when we learn what these creatures can do. They drain a person of happiness and joy, and in the worst case, through the Dementor's kiss, they can take away the soul itself. In the books, we learn that Dementors have always been associated with Azkaban. The Ministry of Magic used their services, seeing their ability to strip prisoners of the will to live as the perfect protection against escape. Officially, no one in the books seems to dwell too much on where these beings came from. It is treated more as a grim reality that already exists. The extended knowledge about Ekrizdis appears only in texts written by Rowling and published on Pottermore, today known as Wizarding World. In one article, the author explains that before Azkaban became a prison, a mysterious fortress existed on the island, and its owner was the dark wizard Ekrizdis. After his death, the concealment spells lost their power, and only then did wizards discover the nightmare hidden there. Different methods of cleansing the island were considered, but the Dementors seemed to coexist with the walls of the place so closely that any attempt to destroy the fortress might have unleashed a plague of them upon the entire magical world. Perhaps the greatest paradox in the history of the wizarding community is that, out of fear that the Dementors might scatter, the Ministry of Magic decided not to destroy the island or seal it away. Instead, it chose to use its dark potential. That was how the idea emerged to transform the old fortress into a prison for the most dangerous criminals of the wizarding world. From that moment on, the grim history of Azkaban continued officially, now supervised by the very institution most witches and wizards regarded as the foundation of order. In effect, the ministry declared that villains and criminals of the wizarding world could be imprisoned in Azkaban, and their guards would be the Dementors themselves, fully empowered and hungry for any trace of positive emotion. For a long time, this practice was not criticized as strongly as one might expect. As so often happens in politics, many people accepted it as the so-called lesser evil. The Dementors were contained in one place, and the authorities had some degree of control over them. Better, some argued, to keep them in one isolated location than to allow them to spread across Britain. In the third book of the series, Prisoner of Azkaban, J.K. Rowling introduces Dementors as horrifying guards sent to protect Hogwarts after Sirius Black escapes from Azkaban. For the first time, we experience with Harry the shock of direct contact with a Dementor, the feeling of happiness being drained away, a terrible headache, loss of strength, the return of the most painful memories. It is also there that we learn the defensive spell known as the Patronus Charm, Expecto Patronum. This shining guardian, formed from positive memories, is the only truly effective shield against a Dementor's power. In later parts of the series, especially in Order of the Phoenix, we see the Ministry facing a crisis caused by the attitude of Cornelius Fudge, who does not believe, or refuses to believe, that Voldemort has returned. At that point, the Dementors begin slipping out of control and showing a stronger tendency to attack random people. Then, in Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort takes real power over the wizarding world, the Dementors ally themselves with the Dark Lord's forces and patrol the streets. This ultimately proves just how fragile the agreement between the Ministry and these beings had always been. As mentioned earlier, the canon novels do not contain any character who openly claims credit for creating the Dementors, nor is any spell cast by one wizard identified in the books as the beginning of their existence. That is why it is often more accurate to say that Ekrizdis contributed to the emergence of Dementors, rather than that he manufactured them. The island, the fortress, The web of dark magic, the suffering and fear that radiated there for decades. All of it together created a unique and extremely dangerous environment in which these dark creatures were born. Rowling's essays on Pottermore seem to support this theory. She does not present Ekrizdis as a mad alchemist in the style of Frankenstein. Rather, he appears as a dark torturer, a man who saturated a place with so much evil energy that he caused the materialization of beings that symbolize despair and hopelessness. Many fans and researchers of the Harry Potter world have pointed out the metaphorical meaning of Dementors. J.K. Rowling has admitted many times in interviews that one inspiration behind these beings was her own struggle with depression. A Dementor symbolizes a state of despair so deep that a person is unable to summon even a single happy memory. This theme runs through the entire series, and the Patronus charm, a defense based on positive emotions and memories, becomes the opposing force to everything Dementors represent. Why does this matter in the context of Ekrizdis? Because he represents an exaggerated image of a man who lost himself in evil so completely that the entire place where he lived became soaked in negative energy. In that sense, the most terrifying part of his story may be this. One individual, insanely cruel and skilled in dark magic, could contribute to the birth of creatures that feed on suffering and fear. When Ekrizdis finally vanished from the world, according to legend, dying alone, consumed by his own curses, wizards began to discover the Cursed Island. At first, the Ministry of Magic had no idea what to do with the grim fortress. Abandoned and hidden in the northern depths of the North Sea, it was dominated by Dementors, who seemed to have made their home inside its walls and tunnels. Fear spread that if anyone tried to root out the demons of darkness from Azkaban, they would scatter across the continent. Such a scenario could have marked the beginning of an unimaginable catastrophe. So instead of creating a greater danger, the Ministry chose a pragmatic, though morally questionable, solution. It offered the Dementors a kind of arrangement. By allowing them to remain on the island, the Ministry could also make use of their terrifying abilities, keeping the worst prisoners in the wizarding world under a constant state of fear. And in this way, Azkaban officially became the most feared prison in the magical world. The Dementors became its terrifying guards, and their presence sealed the dark nature of the place. This lasted for decades, until the modern era of Harry Potter, when people finally began to realize that cooperation with such dangerous beings could prove disastrous. It was not hard to predict that, in the moment of trial, when Voldemort began rising to power once again, the Dementors would turn away from the Ministry and join the Dark Lord's army. After all, could anyone truly expect loyalty from beings whose only motivation was the hunger to drain joy and happiness? Looking at this story from the perspective of time, one question naturally arises. Did Ekrizdis truly dream of creating such a destructive force? Or was he simply so blinded by cruelty that he never understood the consequences of his actions? Whatever the answer may be, the facts remain the same. He laid the foundations for Azkaban, and he was responsible for the dark energy that gathered around the island. In histories written by wizards, Ekrizdis appears as the archetype of a dark wizard who knew no limits to his evil. Many compare him to Gellert Grindelwald or even Lord Voldemort, though they acted on a far greater scale and carried ambitions of world conquest. Ekrizdis was a recluse. He focused on his experiments, but the side effect of those experiments was the creation or summoning of beings that would remain one of the most terrifying plagues in the history of the wizarding world. Although Dementors exist in the minds of most fans mainly as the terrifying creatures of Azkaban and as symbols of despair, few truly stop to wonder where they actually came from. The name Ekrizdis, pulled from the shadows by J.K. Rowling's additional material, gives this story a new dimension. Darker and at the same time fascinating. Here was a single wizard, a man obsessed with power over others, and he left behind a legacy so powerful that it shaped entire generations of the magical world. As long as the memory of Dementors remains alive, so too will the memory of Ekrizdis continue to smolder. The memory of someone who chose isolation in order to spread suffering in its purest form. Stories and legends have always warned against evil that creates more evil, and the history of the Dementors is one of the clearest examples. Because darkness never truly dies, there may always come another dark wizard, ready to resurrect forgotten rituals That is why the wizarding world must remain vigilant, so that never again can forces as destructive as those born within the cold walls of Azkaban be brought into existence. And although, in the main canon, no one speaks the name Ekrizdis, the shadow of that dark wizard still echoes in every howl of wind that passes through the walls of Azkaban. The only question that remains is whether one day, perhaps in future stories, we will learn more about this mysterious, forgotten creator of the most monstrous guards in the history of magical Britain.